We're doing a series right now on the book of Proverbs, and one of the things I love about Proverbs is how practical it is. It's not dry, it's not overly philosophical, it's the kind of everyday wisdom your grandma might have given you while you were sitting at her kitchen table. Like I said last week, the fact that wisdom is personified as a woman in the book of Proverbs, Sophia, makes a lot of sense to me because I come from a family of strong, smart women like my maternal grandma. She was a big influence on me. She wasn't perfect, but her love and her wisdom really gave me a strong foundation. And I just grew up just a half a block away from her, so I was at her house all the time as a kid. And one of the things I learned from her was how to be thrifty with money. My grandma worked in downtown Des Moines as a bailiff at the courthouse. And this was her, I just got this from my mom and dad, this was her badge from 50 years ago. She carried this with her, a deputy's badge. So she was a good one, tough one. And sometimes over her lunch hour, she'd go shopping. And one of her favorite places to find bargains was a store she called Sally's. Only when I got a little bit older did I learn that my grandma's favorite store was actually a Salvation Army thrift store. She just called it Sally's because that sounded fancier. And so that's what we've been calling it ever since. Because of her influence, I've been shopping at thrift stores ever since I was a teenager, and I taught my kids to do the same. Every year before school started, we went through the same routine. I gave them a choice. I'd say, either we can go to the mall and you can get one or two new outfits, or we can go to Sally's and you can buy as much as you can carry. And at first they weren't quite so sure about that, but eventually they caught on, and they're all thrift shoppers now too. My ancestors were not wealthy people. They were coal miners, carpenters. They didn't have much, but they were good stewards of what they did have. They were wise and disciplined in how they made and spent and gave their money. All of them were active in church. That's how my parents met, was because both of their parents went to Capitol Hill Christian Church in Des Moines. My ancestors honored God with their tithes and offerings and times. I don't know if they intentionally tried to pass on those values and that wisdom to their children and grandchildren, but they did. The book of Proverbs represents that same kind of generational passing on of wisdom, only in this case, it really was very much intentional. I learned this week that the first 9 chapters of Proverbs takes the form of 12 fatherly talks, with each one beginning with an appeal to my son. And that word, son, comes up something like 50 times in Proverbs. Sometimes it's translated in some translations, child, but it's the same word. And for good reason, because Solomon was writing Proverbs for his son, whose name was Rehoboam. For instance, in the first chapter of Proverbs, Solomon writes, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching, for they are fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck." Solomon wanted the best for his son, like we all want for our kids. And he knew that he would one day follow him as king in Israel. But unfortunately, Rehoboam was a greenhorn, kind of like I talked about on the first Sunday of this series, right? He was a greenhorn like I was as a kid. He had the best possible mentor in his father Solomon. He had access, when he became king, to the best counselors, and yet he still wound up choosing the path of foolishness over the path of wisdom. And if you want to read his story, if you want to read how that all transpired, you can look it up in 1 Kings chapter 12. It tells the story about how after Rehoboam became king, after Solomon's death, he inherited a strong and united kingdom in Israel. It was the height of Israel's power and success. And so the first thing he did, you can see that the picture there, the first one, he went to some of the older men who had worked with his father, and he asked them for advice, for counsel, for wisdom, which was a smart move on his part. Because Solomon he'd been pretty heavy-handed, especially near the end, on taxes and work requirements while he was building his palace and the temple. So the old man told Rehoboam, it would be wise for you to lighten it up a little bit. Take it easy on the people. But Rehoboam disregarded their counsel. Nowadays it'd be like a millennial or Gen Zer saying, okay, boomer, right? I'm not going to listen to you. He disregarded their advice. And so instead he went to the younger guys that he'd grown up with. And this is what we read in 1 Kings. It says, the young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus you should say to the people, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. You see what he was trying to do? He wanted to show how tough he was going to be, what a strong king he was going to be, but it was a disaster, right? Needless to say, it didn't go over well. The nation fell apart. That's what the last image represents. It fell apart under Rehoboam's leadership. The northern kingdom of Israel said, that's enough. We don't want any more of that. And they separated from the southern kingdom of Judah, and from that time on, they were enemies. They split north and south. Instead of choosing the path of wisdom, Rehoboam chose the path of pride. Instead of listening to the wise counsel of his father that he grew up with, and his father's advisors later when he asked them, instead he listened to fools. And he paid the price. I love the fact, I say this all the time, but I love the fact that the Bible is not afraid to tell us the truth about the failures of our spiritual ancestors. People like Rehoboam and even Solomon. He wasn't perfect either. That's why these stories have been preserved for us, so we don't make the same mistakes they did. The wonderful thing about Proverbs is that now we can listen in on Solomon's wisdom, right? We can choose the path that we will walk. Reading Proverbs, again, it's almost like sitting at a very ancient kitchen table as one of our wisest ancestors shares with us some very practical wisdom about life. Last week, we considered what Solomon had to say about relationships. And there's lots and lots of stuff in Proverbs. If you sit down about relationships, all different kinds of relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, sexual relationships, you name it, it's all in there. This week, we're covering Solomon's wisdom regarding money. How we make it, how we spend it, how we use it to honor God. Solomon knew that the love of money was a trap. And so this was one of the things he said. He talked about greed with his son. He wrote, those who are greedy for unjust gain make trouble for their households. Open a newspaper, turn on the news, any day of the week, you're going to see that proverb lived out. We see it all the time. Or this one, the greedy person stirs up strife, but whoever trusts in the Lord will be enriched. Like my grandma, passing on her wisdom about everything from thrifting to family relationships. She had a lot to say about those kinds of things too, to finding a good church and supporting it. That was important to her. Just like that, Solomon wanted his son to understand something really important, especially a rich father to what would be a rich heir someday, and that is that money isn't everything. It's not. And Solomon knew a few things about money. He was basically like the Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, or Elon Musk of his time. He was super rich, crazy rich. Somebody did some research on Solomon and figured out, based on what the Bible says about how much gold was in his treasury, that he was like the sixth richest person in the history of the world. I don't know how he figured that. I don't know who else is on that list. But the point is, the lack of money was never a problem for Solomon. It was never a problem for Rehoboam. The love of money and the lack of wisdom, that was a problem. That was a problem. And that's what Solomon was trying to communicate when he wrote these words in Proverbs chapter 3. Honor the Lord with your substance and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. My child, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves the one he loves, as a father, the son in whom he delights. Happy are those who find wisdom and those who get understanding, for her income is better than silver, and her revenue better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are the ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called happy. Now, when I read these words from Proverbs, I come away with two big truths about living a happy and faithful life. And the first is honor God with your money, with the first fruits of your labor. Give God the best of what you have, and you'll never lack for anything. That's the promise. And secondly, value wisdom above all else. Make growing in faith and spiritual maturity your top priority. And everything else will fall into place. It's exactly what Jesus was saying, one of my favorite texts, where he says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all of those other things will be added. All those things you worry about, they'll be taken care of too. That's what Solomon is saying here. Put God first. And just like it says at the end of the Serenity Prayer, some of you know the Serenity Prayer, that prayer ends with, and you'll be reasonably happy in this life. I love that. You'll be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with Him forever in the next. Love that. I believe that. And I try to practice it. But the funny thing for me is that whenever the topic of tithes and offerings comes up in our preaching schedule, and I'm given the opportunity to talk about it, I always feel like I should somehow recuse myself. I think maybe a lot of preachers feel that way, which is kind of like what a judge is supposed to do, right? When they have a personal or financial interest in the outcome of a case. When the topic of stewardship comes up, I feel like I have a little bit of a conflict of interest, because when I preach about giving, I'm talking to the very people who will ultimately pay my salary. But the reality is, the Bible talks about money and our relationship to it all the time. It's almost impossible to avoid. I mean, you have to work to avoid it because it's everywhere. Solomon talked about it. Jesus talked about it. Paul talked about it. They all did. So recusal on my part really isn't an option. I also know that if I don't talk about it, if I don't talk about what it means to honor God with our money, you probably aren't going to hear about it anywhere else. You're not going to hear about it on CNBC or Fox Business. Now, there's some financial advisors out there that get it. Some of you may listen to Dave Ramsey. He's one that gets it. But like so many other things that we've talked about already, the world's wisdom and God's wisdom are often very, very different things. Almost contradictory things. Solomon said, give away the best of what you have. Honor God with it. And God will in turn bless you. People of faith get that. But I guarantee you, if you use a computer to track your finances, your financial software won't. It doesn't get it. Years ago, in the early days of the personal computer, I bought a program called Managing Your Money. And those exactly what the discs look like. I was able to find a picture of them. And And I was a little bit obsessed. I tracked every single penny I spent, put it into my computer, and like any logical money manager, it scolded me when I overspent my budget. But it also praised me when I didn't. So one year, I got behind on my tithe to the church. And it kept telling me what a great job I was doing. Keep it up, it said. Look at all the money you're saving. And I was like, no, it's not supposed to work like that. But it's exactly how the world works. Giving money away, even to God, doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a purely logical and mathematical point of view. If you leave the spiritual stuff out of it, doesn't make much sense, especially right now. So the standard deduction changed a couple of years ago. So I'm going to get a little wonky here in terms of taxes, but I looked it up. The standard deduction now for a married couple filing jointly in 2023 is $27,700. That means you've got to have a total deduction, okay, that includes charitable giving plus some other things. And I guarantee you, it doesn't make much sense, because unless you make like $277,000 a year, even if you tithe, you're not going to get a bigger tax refund if you give. So your computer software, your financial advisor is going to probably tell you, no, just skip that. Don't do that. Like so many other things about our faith, when it comes to giving, there's a paradox at work. And again, some financial advisors like Dave Ramsey get it. Solomon certainly got it. My parents got it. My grandparents got it. It's not about getting money for money's sake, even though for most of us, it seems like life is supposed to be about. It's not about that. And if that becomes your focus, you're going to be unhappy. You just are. It's about getting rich toward God. It's about honoring God with the first fruits of your labor. It's about investing in things of eternal value. Invest in those things. That's where wisdom comes from. That's where happiness comes from. A little over a week ago, one of our families, Steve and Dolores Benner, have a farm outside of Montrose. They had a major fire, and they lost a big building, a barn that was filled with a lifetime's worth of work. They lost a car, motorcycles, tools, tractors, much, much more. When Dolores let everyone know about the fire on Facebook, the very first thing she did was quote these words from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Don't store up treasures on earth where they can be eaten by moths and get rusty, where thieves break in and steal. Store up your treasures in heaven, where they will never become moth-eaten or rusty, and they will be safe from thieves. And then, of course, she added fire to that list too. I have no doubt that by framing their loss that way, communicating it that way, Steve and Dolores helped their family and their friends and fellow church members to understand a little bit better what a wise and faithful relationship to our money and possessions looks like. No doubt about it. It's good to have nice things, the ability to do that. But it's even better to invest in things of eternal value, things that really last, because stuff in this world doesn't last. It won't last. Most of it's going to wind up in a dump somewhere, in a landfill somewhere. That's where most of our stuff goes. So, the wisdom of Solomon is honor God with your money. That's the bottom line. Do that, and the Bible promises blessings will flow in your direction. That promise is repeated over and over again in the Bible. Now, how that works exactly, I don't know. I really don't. Can't prove that to you scientifically. Only through my experience and through the experience of lots and lots of other people. I like to say it's above my pay grade, so I can't explain it. But I can tell you it works. It did for my parents and for my grandparents, and it has for me. The more Tammy and I give, the more blessings seem to come our way. And that's been true since in the middle of a financial crisis, we decided we were going to start tithing, even when we couldn't afford it. And suddenly our luck changed. Isn't that interesting how that works? In that moment. 30 years ago, when I was a young parent, I had a good friend explain to me how he was teaching his kids the importance of tithing. And one day he sat them down and he showed them his family checkbook. And he showed them how much they spent every month on their mortgage payment, on their utility bills, and their groceries. And then he showed them how much he and his wife gave to the church, which was a full tenth of their income. Tammy and I did the same thing when my kids were teenagers. And I remember it kind of freaked them out. They were like, "You're giving away how much money?" It's like, that we could be spending that money. I mean, you could see the look on their face. I could use that money. We did that not because it was about bragging, but because we wanted them to see, clearly see, what we valued, what we honored. In the end, we all have a choice to make. And for many of us, and I believe this, how we relate to our money is where the rubber meets the road in terms of our faith. In terms of our faith and our walk with God, that's where the rubber meets the road, right there. It's the one place, maybe not the one place, but it's certainly one place in which living out our faith actually costs us something tangible. Solomon taught his son to honor God with his substance, with the first fruits of his labor. He taught him to value God's wisdom and guidance above everything else. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. That advice is as wise now as it was 3,000 years ago. Therefore, may we go and do likewise.